Мы продолжаем наше 27-е банное чтение.
We continue our 27th bathhouse meetings, Anthropology of Violence. Just in case, I remind to the people who just joined, our section is State and Violence today. And before I pass the word to our third speaker, I ask all the our audience to participate in the discussion. After each report, we're having the discussion. I'm happy to introduce our third speaker, Lynn Patyk, Dartmouth College of USA.
Provocation as tactic and discourse, a study of two political cultures, Russia versus US.
First of all, I would like to thank Irina Prokhorova for inviting me to the Bath readings. It's an honor to be here today. My title you can see on the slide, and Irina just said it. It's The Violence of Provocation as Tactic and Discourse, a study of two political cultures. So I'm going to begin with a somewhat provocative quote. They, that is the political left, have decided that there are some things you shouldn't say anymore. And when you say one of those things, you become the enemy. But words aren't violence, they're just words. Thus concludes Donald Trump Jr. in his book called Triggered, How the Left Thrives on Hate and Wants to Silence Us, published in 2019. My paper today will examine the false dichotomy of words violence in the operation of provocation as a political communication and a strategy and performance. I will argue that provocation fundamentally calls into question what is violence and what violence is, by confounding narratives of causality as well as subject, object, perpetrator, victim, and word-deed distinctions. The provocateur's violence is subsumed within the cooptation of the other's agency, which becomes the provocateur's surrogate or medial extension to achieve the objective of their provocation. While provocation is a universal communication strategy, it has culturally specific forms within national histories, political cultures, and media ecosystems. My discussion will take its examples from contemporary Russian and American political culture in order to argue that despite divergent histories and linguistic usage of the word, provokatia, provocation, the tactical methods are structurally and functionally similar. I will begin by talking briefly about provocation's discursive formations, how and in what context the word is used in Russophone and Anglophone, specifically American culture. But my ultimate interest here is in provocation as a political tactic and the two theories or frameworks that best capture the operation of this tactic. My central concern is to distinguish between two widespread and highly effective forms of political provocation, what I'll refer to as manipulative provocation and adversarial provocation, and to analyze a sensationally successful and consequential instance of each type. In Russia, especially in political and media discourse, the word provocation, provokatia, has much greater salience and resonance. Russians have substantial historical experience with secret police and political provocation, and concomitantly broader linguistic usage of provokatia in these domains. The word provocation in Russian has a Latin etymology, but has two cognates, provokatia and provocирование. Provokatia has a distinctly political and military association and an overwhelmingly negative balance. A provocateur especially a political one, is a stigmatized designation, which keeps company with other stigmatized terms for bad political actors, including terrorists, extremists, hackers, whereas provocateur is a more broadly neutral term and refers to communicative behavior. Russian observers, Mikhail Piotrovsky and Michel Berdy from the Moscow Times, were some of the first to note the word's particularity in Russian language culture, as well as the resurgence of provocateur during the Putin era. And they noted this as early as 2012. Statistics from the National Corpus of the Russian Language confirmed their early hypothesis. The spike in usage between the early 2000s and the present is marked, with significant surges in 2012 and 2014. The word's resonance among Russian speakers suggests provokatsio's status as a cultural keyword that bears powerful, affective, and mnemonic charge. Cultural keywords, as conceptualized by sociolinguist Anna Wierzbicka, are, quote, conceptual tools that reflect a society's past experience of doing and thinking about things in certain ways and help to perpetuate these ways. As society changes, these tools do too, and they may be gradually modified and discarded, end quote. Provokacja in Russian reflects a culturally specific way of conceptualizing agency and blame in a conflict. And despite the word's roots in the revolutionary period of Russian history, the word provokacja has not been discarded. Far from it. In July 2019, Vladimir Rubinsky of Vedomosti published an article explaining how everything around us has become provokacja. And half a year later, my own article, The Return of Provokacja in Putin-era Russia, was published in the Russian Review. It's hard to be faster than a journalist. Independently of one another, we arrived at very similar conclusions, namely that despite Russians' deep familiarity and increasing usage, the word provocation had been co-opted for the purposes of propaganda and information warfare and rendered virtually meaningless. Rubinsky puts it in this way. The doping story, provocation, period. The Skripal affair, provocation, period. Interference in the US election, provocation, period. And what kind of provocation it is, wherein it consists, what concretely it's connected with, let those who want to delve into it do so. And if in delving into it, they'll pour water on the mill of the provocateurs. Now, part of the task of any scholarly discussion of provocation as a tactic, rather than provocation as discourse, is therefore to restore the meaning of this profoundly corrupted and weaponized word of Russian political discourse, in order to analyze its specificity as a political tactic, one which it is imperative to fully understand, especially in our completely mediatized world, where local discrete provocations have international reach and influence a global audience. The task with regard to American language culture is different. Americans make much more limited recourse to the concept of provocation, and the word has relatively little salience in political and media discourse. It would not be unfair to say that Americans have a relatively elementary understanding of provocation. When Rush Limbaugh, a very prominent and controversial right-wing talk show radio host, died in February, the American mass media, including the Washington Post and Reuters among them, referred to him as a conservative radio provocateur. You can see the headlines. Rush Limbaugh, conservative radio provocateur and cultural phenomenon, dies at 70. And US conservative radio provocateur and Trump ally, Rush Limbaugh, dies. Rather than clarifying the nature of Rush Limbaugh's activity, the usage of the word provocateur confused many Americans who did not know what a provocateur was or how this odd French word applied to such a familiar homegrown public figure. Merriam-Webster Dictionary online identified provocateur as a trending word the week of February 17, 2021, when lookups of the word had spiked by 6,100% in the wake of Limbaug's death. Rather than using the word provocation, Americans tend to employ concrete, easy-to-grasp metaphors, which obscure the precise operation of provocation and replace it with something else. False flag is the ready metaphor for a provocation perpetrated by an adversary undercover or masquerading in order to falsely place the blame for the violence on the target of provocation. False flag is used both in reference to geopolitical provocations, but also to domestic ones. Both internationally and domestically, political conflict is increasingly driven by power politics, which seeks populist support by fueling domestic culture wars. In the US culture wars, the right uses the tactic of provocation, which they refer to by the metaphors of triggering and owning. These metaphors are significant and revealing. A trigger is a mechanism on a gun, which causes it to fire. But as a verb, it is a transitive verb, which means to set something off, like a chemical reaction or an explosion. The purpose of triggering is to offend your liberal political opponents by violating their cherished political ideals and cultural norms. Thus, the Trump supporter wearing the t-shirt in the image that says Trump 2016, fuck your feelings, right? The purpose of triggering, as I said, is to violate these cultural norms and to produce an outraged reaction. To own, on the other hand, is obvious. To have possession, dominion, and control over, and in the process, to humiliate your opponent. A recent example of owning the libs, a very recent one from just a couple weeks ago, occurred in the wake of completely false rumors that circulated in the right-wing media ecosystem, charging that President Biden was going to ban hamburgers as part of his climate plan. The fake climate plan hamburger ban provided the right with a prime opportunity to own the libs by flaunting their defiance through their overconsumption of hamburgers. And you can see Donald Trump Jr.'s Twitter boast that he had eaten 4 pounds of red meat the previous day. Scholars and commentators of right-wing political performance culture have observed that those who engage in these kinds of provocations are often willing to take a hit. That is, in other words, to inflict damage on themselves for the sake of this show of aggression and defiance towards their political opponents. And I do want to point out that this all happens virtually, right? Most of it takes place via social media. Now, in the remainder of the talk, I'd like to present 2 models of political provocation with the objective of elucidating profoundly influential acts of political communication and violence that are at the core of provocation. The first is political provocation that targets supporters in order to influence and manipulate them, essentially turning them into medial extensions of the provoking actor for the purpose of achieving his or her objective. In his excellent and rigorous study of provocation discourse, provocaирование, Valentin Stepanov defines provocation, and he is not speaking specifically about political provocation, as, quote, the symbolic representation of actually experienced or imitated emotions, feelings, states, with the intention of infecting their interlocutor with them and eliciting an internal state which doesn't correspond to the target's actual state. Stepanov's emphasis on the provocateur's infection of the addressee with their emotion or state recalls Tolstoy's definition of real art in What is Art, In fact, we need only to take minimal liberties with Tolstoy's original text and replace his word art with our word provocation to produce a wonderful definition of manipulative provocation that closely aligns with Stepanov's. Tolstoy's very lightly revised definition of real art applied to provocation pinpoints the nature of the violence. Quote, "A real work of provocation destroys in the consciousness of the receiver the separation between himself and the provocateur, nor that alone, but also between himself and all whose minds receive this provocation. If a man is infected by the provocateur's condition of soul, if he feels this emotion and this union with others, then the object which has affected this is provocation." All right, so obviously I messed with Tolstoy's definition a little bit. I always was skeptical of it as a definition of art, but I do think it functions beautifully as a definition of manipulative provocation. For my illustrations, I have taken the two most prominent and consequential provocations in American and Russian political culture from recent months, because they will be familiar to all of us, but they are highly politicized, as you will all know. The first is former US President Donald Trump's provocation of his supporters to insurrection at the Capitol in order to overturn the results of the November presidential election. Prior to and during his presidency, Trump had effectively used Facebook and Twitter to lead the way in provoking, that is, in triggering and owning the libs. Following the November presidential election, Trump continued to infect his supporters with his emotions and state as he made outrageous conspiracist claims about the massive voter fraud and a stolen election. At his rally prior to his supporters marching to and storming the Capitol, Trump performed defiance in his characteristic fashion through gesture, facial expression, intonation, and speech. Most significant for manipulative provocation is the deniability afforded by the device of indirect speech, which Trump used consistently and to great effect. The semantic content of the speech, however, is absolutely irrelevant. What is far more crucial is the shared references and affect and his ultimate device of indirect speech to achieve his objectives. This is what Trump said. He said, "Today we see a very important event though, because right over there, right there, we see the event going to take place. And I'm going to be watching because history is going to be made. We're going to see whether or not we have great and courageous leaders, or whether or not we have leaders that we should be ashamed of themselves throughout history, throughout eternity. They'll be ashamed. And you know what? If they do the wrong thing, we should never, ever forget that they did. Never forget. We should never, ever forget." This indirect speech contains absolutely clear instructions to his supporters and an equally clear threat to potential obstructors among his own party. Essentially, he's saying, "I'm watching. Do what I want you to do, otherwise your heads will be on the chopping block." Notice that he uses the first person plural form of we. This is not the royal we. What it signifies is what Tolstoy referred to as the destruction of the consciousness of separation between his supporters and himself, right, the provocateur. But of course, Trump had no intention of doing anything himself, but of weaponizing his supporters to do his dirty work for him. Trump's manipulative targeting of his supporters is well captured by Stepanov's definition and its further elaboration, as I did with reference to Tolstoy. In his 1998 study, Stachel und Speer, Machtstudien, German sociologist Taina Paris elucidates a different form of provocation as an adversarial rather than as a manipulative tactic of a social movement to attract attention to its cause and to delegitimize its opponent. In the context of a long-standing conflict and an asymmetrical conflict, a social movement deploys provocation in the form of a norm violation, which poses an existential threat to its target's identity, which causes the provoked party to overreact to the challenge, and by doing so, to discredit and delegitimize itself. This is the ultimate symbolic goal of the provocation, according to Paris, the self-unmasking or self-exposure of the target of provocation before an audience of third-party adjudicators who can be tapped as potential allies or supporters if the provocateur succeeds in displacing the blame for the conflict on the adversary and having his reality construction accepted as the truth of the conflict, right? The truth of the matter. Alexei Navalny's return to Moscow on January 17th was a classic and spectacularly successful instance of adversarial provocation. I'm reluctant to use the word provocation in regard to Navalny, since the word has been deployed against opposition politicians in Russia since the Bolotny protests in 2012. Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation have been criminalized and stigmatized in official discourse in all sorts of ridiculous ways. But without the concept of provocation, we have no precise tool with which to properly appraise the objectives and technical efficacy of Navalny's action. Two factors play a critical role in the success of Navalny's provocation, aside from its sheer audacity: the asymmetry of the conflict and the global mediatization of the action in real time and for the duration. Media attention is supremely fickle, but Navalny has managed to sustain international media attention since January. As the target of provocation, the Russian government has a plethora of resources at its disposal and the ability to game out its reaction in advance. After all, it knew that Navalny was returning. In spite of this, it overreacted, in Paris' sense, in a number of trivial and more significant ways, most notably in the overbearing police action and the mass arrest of protesters on January 23rd. In Paris' theory of provocation, overreaction is almost guaranteed because the state is in a bind. It's in a catch-22 situation. The state must appear strong in order to maintain its legitimacy, and to do so, it relies upon the demonstration of its power and authority in the form of the exercise of state violence. Yet its overreaction consists precisely in inflicting violence upon its own citizens, and therefore exposing the state's illegitimacy. Navalny provoked the state's violence against himself and his supporters before a national and global audience of third-party adjudicators in the conflict, and he continued to do so successively, even in his hunger strike, which can also be understood and analyzed as an adversarial provocation in Paris's terms. Paris identifies insurgent or terrorist violence as the most extreme form of adversarial provocation. But Navalny's provocation, like Pussy Riots in 2012, used nonviolent tactics to provoke the discrediting and delegitimizing violence of the state. However, provocation is nothing if not a double-edged sword, and Navalny's detractors will support the state-sponsored narrative, which is that despite the preponderance of force on the Russian state side, Navalny is to blame for provoking the violence. So I must emphasize a very important nuance. In using the concept of adversarial provocation to describe Navalny's action, I am arguing that he is provoking and exposing the violence of the Russian state, rather than blaming Navalny for the Russian state's violence. This would be to suggest that Navalny, and not Putin, has control over the state's police and punitive apparatus. This is clearly not the case. The state's violence is its own responsibility, even if it relentlessly attempts to foist responsibility for the conflict onto the opposition by accusing them of provocatia. To conclude, American political culture and language culture may exhibit only a basic usage and elementary understanding of provocation. And the word provocatia in Russian language culture may be thoroughly corrupted and weaponized. Nevertheless, January 6th, and as well as its enduring consequences, and January 17th and its sequels demonstrate that provocation is a tactic, as a tactic is not a sideshow and no longer confined to covert operations of the secret police, but a supremely effective, attention-riveting means of political communication and performance with violence at its heart. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Colleagues, at this, I would urge you to ask your questions or share your observations. First and forward, the floor goes to our participants who would like to ask a question to Lynn. I can't see who's raising their hands. Okay, just give me a second. Lynn, so we've got Oleg who's raising his hand. Okay, Oleg. Livnyuk, could you please unmute yourselves because we can't hear you. Your microphone is off. Oleg, please unmute yourselves. We can't hear you. I can't, what? Irina, you can unmute yourselves. Apparently I can't. Okay, now you've been unmuted. Well, you see, I was muted. I was told not. Well, the host was supposed to give me the right to mute myself. Okay, that was very interesting. And the historical evolution of the concept is just something I find incredibly interesting. For a long time, when people were talking about provocation in Russia, they would mean activities of agents or various security departments in the revolutionary movement. That would be considered to be a provocation. As far as I understand, there has been a lot of evolution from this narrow understanding of the issue. Were there any stages, iterations? Was there any evolution of the concept, in your opinion, and these practices of provocation, historically speaking?
Yeah, thank you, Oleg, for the question. So my research on provocation began a long time ago when I was still a graduate student. And it was in conjunction with my study of the movement, the revolutionary movement and revolutionary terrorism. And provocation and revolutionary terrorism, these are two histories that are absolutely intertwined. So provocatia as a word, it entered, according to Dahl, it entered Russia during the epoch of Peter the Great from the Polish. And it came into use really in the era of great reforms. Alexander Herzen used it when the fires of 1862 were being blamed on revolutionary arsonists. And Herzen said, no, this is a police provocatia, right? The police and the state are behind these fires. They are trying to cast the blame upon the revolutionaries in order to justify their repressions in 1862. So the tactic became more widespread after the 1881 assassination of Alexander II, right, by the people's will. And the Akhrana realized it didn't have the tactics, the methods to deal with revolutionary terrorism, and that they were going to use what they called satrudniki to infiltrate revolutionary groupings. And that's what they did. And they called them satrudniki. But the revolutionaries used a more pejorative term, which was provocateur, right? Which carries with it this stigma already. And then, of course, this became a major part of revolutionary culture and revolutionary discourse. And Vladimir Burtsev, during the early revolutionary period, so the 1900s, became famous or infamous for unmasking provocateurs within the revolutionary parties. And the culture of paranoia, I would say, pervaded the revolutionary parties, who of course became the leadership, the Soviet leadership. And provocateur continued to be used as a stigmatized designation for an enemy. And their activity became a little bit hazy or foggy here, but throughout the Civil War and then in the Stalinist period. And you can find its usage is extensive during the Cold War as well, but this is more in the realm of geopolitics. And of course, during the last couple of decades, that's where we find also an extremely high increase, sort of a predominant usage of the word provokacja. It's with reference to geopolitics and Russia's foreign adversaries. So yes, it has evolved tremendously, and it has been used in different ways by different people. And I also want to say that this is not just a used word by state or official actors in any way. You find it much more commonly used. You can hardly turn on, you know this yourself, you can hardly turn on the Russian media, any channel. It can be the official media, it can be Dozhd, without someone saying provokacja. Using that to explain someone's action.
Спасибо. Sorry, yes,
Irina,
Nancy,
thank you so much. Nancy?
Nancy, please. Yeah.
Nancy, please.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you, and so much for bringing the American story in with the Russian story. My question is whether there's an antidote to provokacja, to this kind of political speech. That is, how can we get out of this loop we're in American discourse about what Tim Snyder calls the big lie? You know, that once you call it a lie, then the other side will say, no, your lie is the lie. You know? How can we return to a more civil discourse in either the American civil society or Russian?
Oh, Nancy, that's a fantastic question, and I wish I had the answer. But I will say that this mirroring that you say, right? So mirror allegations are a part of the whole dynamic of provocation discourse, right? And this happens internationally between the United States and Russia, and also you see domestically, right, between our two political cultures within our divided society. I think calls for civil discourse, they're going to fall on deaf ears. I don't think that we are going to escape the polarization and division and provocation, triggering and owning. And this is a problem because provocation is so much about casting blame. I don't want to cast all of the blame on the Republicans, but I do want to say that so much of their political strategy currently has to do with provocation, with owning and triggering the libs, and is much less about policy, right? Policy initiatives and sort of presenting a different ideological vision to the American people, right? So they really stoke their base and win support through this strategy of provocation. And as long as that's a winning strategy for them, I don't see that they're going to give it up.
Thank you. We have one more question from the audience. Thank you for your talk and this very important research. In your opinion, is provocation more a tactic of attack or counter-defense?
So, that is a really interesting question. I think about questions like that a lot. I also think about the question of whether I can separate adversarial provocation and manipulative provocation, or whether they're both often used together, one for offense and one for defense. I will say that in the way that Taina Paris conceives of adversarial provocation, he doesn't call it that, I call it that. He says it's a tactic of a social movement in an asymmetrical conflict, right? Where the other side, the state, the establishment has more power. And so in that case, I would say that it's actually a defense, right? So adversarial provocation, yes, it looks like confrontation. It looks like challenge. It looks like the escalation of conflict. But you have to consider what resources, what tactics a social movement has available to it at any given moment, and also available to it to rivet attention, right? As an attention-getting strategy, provocation is so important. You have to get the public's attention. You have to get the authorities' attention. So especially in a culture, political culture, for example, in Russia, where you have basically the media domination, the domination of the media by the state, right? You have state-aligned media, you have independent media on the internet. It's very hard to get people's attention. So what are you going to do? You have to do something, and you have to draw attention to your cause and keep people engaged. So in a way, maybe I'm saying it's more of a defensive strategy. It is a defensive offensive strategy or an offensive defense, something like that. But that's a great question.
May I ask a question in a way? I'm quite intrigued by this emergence of a new generation of politicians, deeply connected with this tactics of violence and provocation. And in a way, if we could look back, so after the Second World War, all kind of charismatic leaders somehow were impossible because the trauma was so awful. So that was a predilection for these rationalists, you know, and I would say politicians who use this language of tolerance in a way. How would you explain why this is such a fascination towards the so-called charismatic leaders who use this abusive language and somehow, you know, are very attractive to quite a lot of people in a way?
That is a fantastic question. And I had never thought of comparing in any way Trump and Navalny. That had never occurred to me. And then suddenly, when I was looking at these instances, these occasions, it occurred to me that, whoa, these are two charismatic leaders of social movements. And the strange thing was that Trump enjoyed this very liminal position. He was president, so he controlled all the levers of power, but he was also the leader of a social movement. And Navalny is as well. So suddenly we have these charismatic leaders. And I think it has to do with not only what you said, there was a time when it was too dangerous for a charismatic leader to emerge. That's not the case right now. I think in part it has to do with the rise of populism. Right. And the fact that because populism is the driving force of politics in a post-ideological world, right? It is how you sort of cloak yourself in the mantle of democracy and say, I have popular support. That there will come to the fore these charismatic leaders. But also recall, I think there's a lot of historical contingency here. You know, for a long time, there wasn't a charismatic leader of the Russian political opposition, of the liberals in Russia. And God, the Republicans and the Democrats alike, I mean, they have been negative charismatics. Well, except for Obama. Obama had quite a lot of charisma. But so there seems to be some degree of chance about it, but I don't think we can throw out the importance of the personality in history, right? We were moving so much either to the masses in history or structural and systemic causes. And now we see again the rise of sort of, I don't want to say great leaders, but definitely charismatic leaders. And that is a really interesting, I think it also has to do with the rise of authoritarianism and the fact that more sort of institutional means of making the people's will, of expressing the people's will and making it felt are being blocked. So there are going to be more movements and more protests as I see it.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Really sorry to complete this part of our discussion, but we're almost out of time. Thank you so much. And we are now going on to our fourth presentation.